Introduction to Philosophy, Plato and Platonism, Part 2.
Folks, and a hearty welcome to our drive-in theater. We have a wonderful evening's entertainment lined up for you, one that will provide several hours of pleasurable relaxation and diversion for you and your family. Did you fail to dress up for tonight's show? No tie, an old shirt and slacks, a house dress? Well, don't give it a thought. We're glad you came as you are. We just want you to enjoy yourselves. Don't forget to visit our refreshment center during the intermission or any time. You love the tasty array of snacks we have to offer. So will the youngsters. Everything is quality and so good. We hope you'll make this a weekly visit. Bring the family. Bring your friends. There are always wonderful new pictures to see, delightful snacks to nibble, a gay, pleasant evening for all. Oh, a word of caution. Don't drive over 10 miles an hour in the theater area for your safety's sake. And Mom or Pop, go with the kids when they leave the car. We hope you have a wonderful time. Come back soon.
Hi, and I also hope you have a wonderful time. And please, at any time, make use of that refreshment center, which is your kitchen. So just push pause and go grab some food and come back. All right, let's get the show started. This is part 2, and we are going to name this video "The Experience of Platonism." And that name is kind of funny, right? Because Platonism, we know, is a rationalism. And I'm not going to use too much of the notes on the bottom, but I will use them now. So if we recall, rationalism was a priori, right? And that was Latin, shorthand in Latin for before, prior to experience, right? So we don't need experience for a rationalism. It's before experience. So here I have the experience of Platonism, and experience we associated with empiricism, and that was a posteriori, which was after experience, because the empiricist said in order to know the world, first you have to go out and experience it. Well, the rationalist said, no, actually before experience there's just some principles, rules that we start with. And from there we can deduce knowledge of the world. Okay, so here we have our experience of Platonism. Why am I starting that way? Why even bring up experience? Well, I want you, because I think you're going to start off skeptical, and that's you're starting off as an empiricist, I feel. And so you're not ready to yet accept rationalism, and you're gonna have to hear out Plato. And what's the best way to argue for something, to try to appeal to something? By using the other person's mode, right? And in this case, it's the mode of experience. So this is a really sophisticated way to try to appeal to you, to try to get you to take rationalism seriously by starting off by saying, I'm going to give you an experience of Platonism. Okay, so what is that experience going to be? Well, we're going to do sort of a little experiment here. I'm going to show you something. All right, let me make this on paper. Got it all set. I'm going to show it to you, and you're going to tell me what it is. All right, just yell it out loud, because this is not going to be hard. This is not a trick question. You should be able to get this. All right, just here we go. There it is. What is that? Okay, you saw it? You didn't see it? All right, I'll show you to you one more time. There it is. What is this? Should be pretty easy, right? It's not a trick question. It should be the first thing that came into your mind when you saw that. Oh, what was it that you said? I couldn't hear you. You got to really say it loud, because it's got to go through the YouTube tubes, and then it'll come out here. I got an end tube. Oh, okay. So you think it is a square. All right. And that was my answer too, right? I told you this is not a trick question. That was a square. Okay. The next question Plato has for you, right? Once you say, okay, that's a square, is he'll say, okay, what is a square? What's the definition of a square? And now you got to sort of think out back to math class, maybe high school, maybe college, where we study geometry, shapes. What are the essential characteristics that every square has? In order to be a square, it has these. Right? So I've written these out for us, right? And there may be more, and we could actually probably reduce these down to less, but let's just put all these out here. All right, it has to be 4 sides for it to be a square. If it's a 3-sided object, we might be talking about a triangle, right? But square, 4 sides. The perimeter, if you're going to walk around the outside, it's closed, right? And that means that there's, if it's closed, that means that there's a defined inside and an outside to a square. All right, and the sides, all the sides are parallel, right? The opposing sides are parallel. Probably should add that in there. Opposite sides are parallel, right? That means if we extend them out, they will never meet, right? There'll be no intersection. Every angle in the square, all the corners are all 90 degrees, right? That's just part of the definition of being a square. And each of the sides, those are also all of the same length, exact same length. They're all equal. And the square is a 2-dimensional object, right? It appears on a plane, right? It's not like a cube. A cube would be a 3-dimensional object, and a line would be a 1-dimensional object, and a point would be a 0-dimensional object. But with a square, right, that is drawn out on a plane, and so it's 2 dimensions. And finally, all the sides, it's composed of all line segments. So these are lines. All right, so we have all of these different, very important, essential, right? If we don't have these, it's not a square, right? This is the definition of a square. But now we've got to go back. We've got to look at the thing I drew that I showed you before, right? It was on the paper. That's it, if we forgot what it was. It turns out that what I put on that paper does not satisfy any of these, right? It's not really a 4-sided object, right? There's a point on this where it goes past the other line. Right? So it's a weird shape that I made. It's not 4-sided. It also doesn't have a perimeter that's closed. Not all these lines meet up together. Are the lines on either side parallel? No. If we extended those out, they would intersect at some point. Are the angles in what I drew all 90 degrees? No, that's not true either. None of them are perfectly 90 degrees. And is each side of equal length? No. Is it 2-dimensional? Now this, you might say, well, I drew it on paper. So yeah, it's on a single plane. But actually, if we really pulled out our microscope and got a close look, that paper is actually a bed of fibers, and it takes up space. It has a thickness to it. This is probably 20-pound paper, and that thickness means that when I drew that on there, it's going kind of up and down depending on which fiber the ink happened to dry on. So it's not even a 2-dimensional object. And is it composed of line segments? That also is not satisfied, right? Because what I drew there is not; those are not lines. Remember, a line is it's composed of points, one after another. And so it has the width of a point. And a point is a special type of geometrical shape, I guess we could call it nominally, in that it cannot be divided, right? A point is not composed of 2 points. So a point can't be divided. And that means that if I was to draw an actual line, then I would not be able to divide that line in half. But what I drew on that paper, if we zoomed in, we could easily divide it into the left half and the right half. So it's not a line. It's not a series of points. So what I drew on that paper, right, it turns out is nothing like what we just defined. And yet we called that a square, but it's not a square. It doesn't satisfy any of this. So what is the real square? And now what's our answer? We might have to say, well, that real square is inside my head. The actual square that has lines that can't be divided, that's something that is in my mind. That's an idea. And that's the square. The one that I can think of in my head is one that will satisfy all of our requirements, right? Our essential characteristics. It will be four-sided. I'm thinking about it right now. It's four-sided, it's closed perimeter, the sides are parallel. It satisfies all of these. So what's happened here? Well, we've had this sort of reversal, right? What we originally said was the square, now we're saying, well, it's not a square, and the real square, the actual square, isn't out there. It was inside our head. This is the experience of Platonism, what just happened right there, where we saw something, we said what it was, and then we realized, that actually doesn't satisfy what we think a square is, and the only thing that really, really does is something that we think up in our minds, in our head, in our brain. So this is Plato's metaphysics. Metaphysics are fundamental questions, right, about what's real. And Plato makes this fundamental distinction that happens in this experience that we just had. And it's the distinction between appearance and reality. And this is just so fundamental, right? The difference between appearance and reality. And where do we want to be? We want to be in reality. But we end up in appearance often, right? What it turned out we said was a square only appeared to be a square. The actual square was in our head. So Plato is trying to take us from appearances to reality, to something that appears to be a square, to the real square. So this is, now you've had the experience, and if you went through that and you sort of went through those steps, then I think you're going to be more open to Plato, right? At least to take him seriously enough to listen to what he has to say before we make any sort of final judgment about him. But where we're headed is that reality is something that's inside our minds. In the world of appearance, right? Appearance, which is not real, it's fake, is what we encounter through our senses, right? What we see or hear, or smell. So he's moving us from opinion, right, just a belief, to knowledge and truth, right? Something appears a certain way, well, we have opinions about it, but once we know reality, once we have a grasp on reality, then we have knowledge, right? Then we have truth. So he's taking us from believing to knowing. Okay, so the stuff we see in the world of appearance is not real. Reality, actual things, right, in Platonism, are only going to exist in the mind. And this experience we just did with the square is that experience of realizing something is just an appearance and that the real thing is in our mind. All right, so let's see where Plato takes this. Well, okay, he's told us reality is in our mind. How do we then get to truth? How do we figure out what reality is? Well, Plato gives us a method to do that. It's called the dialectical method, and it's dialectical because it's people speaking to each other. He thinks it's a process that occurs where someone is presenting something, and then we test it, and then we put it back, and it's a back and forth. Right? It's a process that gets repeated, and it's performed in conversation. And so the dialogues of Plato are between different interlocutors, they're called, right? And they're all both in pursuit of truth. And they're going to use this method to try to uncover, discover, reveal, recognize that truth. So the dialectical method has 3 steps to it. There's a define step, there's a test step, and then there's a repeat step. And I just want to remind you back to William James when he talks about rationalism, and that rationalists start with principles, right? The whole, something that covers everything. And we said that the definition is just like any other principle. It tries to deal with the whole of something. And then you can get to specifics. Okay, so let us go through this method, and then we'll give some examples of what could happen when we're trying to actually perform it. All right, so the first part, define, come up with a definition. And this is usually in every dialogue, the person that Socrates is speaking to is some sort of authority figure. And so Socrates says, you should know what this is. Tell me what it is. Give me a definition. And that's how practically every single dialogue sort of carries forth. The interlocutor presents a definition. So you could try to define anything, right? So you could try to use this dialectical method at home and say, okay, I'm going to try to find truth. I want to know what love is. I want to know what truth is. I want to know what courage is. I want to know what, you could put anything in there and say, okay, how would I define it? Right? That's the first step in the dialectical method. And for Plato, that's the first step towards trying to distinguish between an appearance, right? What that thing appears to be versus what it really is. So what love appears to be versus what love really is. First, you want to, according to Plato, define it. Okay, so you come up with a definition, then you go to step 2, which is our testing. And we have three tests here that I'm going to give you for how to test the definition. The first test is the contradiction test. And here you're going to see if there's anything in that definition that contradicts itself. Right? And a contradiction is when you say something both is and is not something. Right? And that just doesn't make sense. And it's very important for rationalists that things make sense. So if I say I am human and I am not human, that's a contradiction. I either am or I'm not. Saying I'm both doesn't make sense. All right, so that's test A, or test 1. The second test is the question of whether it's too inclusive. And here we're asking the question of our definition, is there anything that is included in this definition, but we don't think it should be? Right? So our definition captures things that we did not mean to. Right? And if it does do that, then there's something wrong with our definition. It's too inclusive. And the third test is whether or not the definition is too exclusive. Right? Is there anything that's not included? Right? When we use that definition, it's not included, but we think it should be. It is what we're talking about. So we go through these three tests. We figure out whether it's too exclusive, too inclusive, whether there's contradictions. If it turns out we don't pass one of these tests, there is a problem, then we have to go back to step one. Right? That's the next step. Repeat. So we have to say, okay, we went through the test, and if there was no problems, that's great. That means you have a good definition. It doesn't include anything that you didn't want to. It doesn't exclude anything that you think it should be captured by that definition, and there's no contradictions. Wow, it sounds like you have a definition of what something is. You tested it. It passed those tests. It sounds like you've gone from appearance to reality. You have a bit of truth. That's great. That is what Plato wants to happen. But if there are issues, right? If there is a contradiction, or that something is included that shouldn't be, or something is excluded that shouldn't be, then we have to repeat. We have to go back and come up with a different definition. Right? We might just make amendments to our first definition. We might say, okay, well, let me try to change that definition so that it doesn't have that problem. But then once we do that, it's a different definition. Then we have to retest it. Or we may say, you know what, that other definition we started with is really not working when we tested it. Let's just come up with a completely new one. Right? But you have to go back to step one and come up with a definition. All right, let's talk about some examples of using the dialectical method where there's fails, where we go to test something and it turns out that our definition doesn't pass. So let's look at fail A, right? This is for that first test where we're looking at contradictions. And for this one, we're going to go back to chapter 2 from Some Problems of Philosophy that was by William James. And in that chapter, in the back half of the chapter, he talks about a definition of God, right? And it's a pretty common definition, that God is perfect and that God is infinite. But he says if we think about what it means to be perfect, it means that something is complete, that there's nothing more that could be added to it. Right? It's now perfect. Anything less, anything more would mess it all up. When something is perfect, it's complete. And if something is infinite, if you think about what it means for something to be infinite, it means that there's always more to it, right? Something that's infinite is never ending. There's always more to it, which means it's not complete. It's incomplete. So if we say that God is both perfect and infinite, and we try to think about what those words mean, we come to a contradiction, right? That we're saying God is complete and God is not complete. So William James is saying this is something we need to think about. Is this a contradiction that we can resolve? We need to go back to our definition and figure out what to do here. Okay, so that's an example of a definition, and it's not passing the first test. All right, let's think about another definition that doesn't pass the second test. All right, let's go back to that square. And we had all these different essential characteristics. But let's say we just said, well, a square is a shape that has 4 right angles. Right? We might, we have to come up with a quick definition. That's what we said. And well, if that's our definition, then we'd also be including in that definition rectangles, because rectangles also have 4 right angles. So a definition that a square is a shape with 4 right angles includes something that we don't want to include. We don't want to call a rectangle a square. They're different things. So a definition of a square as a shape with 4 right angles does not pass test B. And we'd have to go back and we'd have to fix that definition. Okay. What about a fail of test C? Right, so here I'm going to talk about bravery. Right? Bravery is something that I think we all want to be brave. And for Plato, if you want to be brave, you need to know what bravery is. How could you be brave if you don't even know what it is? So you need to come up with a definition of bravery. And so one definition of bravery might be someone who always runs off into dangerous situations. You say, there's a definition of bravery, and then you test it. Now when you get to test C, you might say, well, you know what? Sometimes the brave thing to do is to refuse to run into a dangerous situation, because maybe that dangerous situation is too dangerous. Maybe it's a situation where there's no way to survive, or you'd be risking everything, but there'd be no gain. There'd be no reason, no benefit to make that kind of risk. And maybe in those situations, the brave thing to do is not to run into the dangerous situation. So now, if we've defined bravery as running into a dangerous situation, we've excluded cases of bravery where it's brave not to run into a dangerous situation. So we've failed this test. We have to go back to the first step. We need to come up with a new definition of bravery, one that would capture both when it is brave to run into a dangerous situation, but also capture those situations where the brave thing to do is not to run into some dangerous situation. Okay, so hopefully now you're getting an idea of how the dialectical method works, and we're trying to come up with good definitions of things. And the first thing we need to do is start with a definition, and then we need to test it. Okay. See what I am. And we're going to do one more slide. All right, so the dialectical method is a way of uncovering the true definition, the essence of something, reality itself. And we have to ask ourselves, I should have stopped before this one. We're going to have to ask ourselves how well this has worked out. Right? Have we figured out reality? Has the dialectical method worked? And so we're actually going to take a break right now in the middle of this slide. And today's video, instead of showing you old uncopyrighted commercials, I'm going to show you an old cartoon, and I'm going to split it up into 4 parts. So actually, the philosophy is the commercial, and the real show is this cartoon you're going to watch, which is a pretty amazing piece of art. It's from 1924, and anything that was produced in 1924 or before is out of copyright. So this is copyright free, and it was one of the first stars of the animated screen, and it's going to be a short film of Felix the cat, and it is called Felix Finds Out, and it's a pretty amazing show. So we're going to watch the first part right now, and we'll be back in a couple minutes. All right. So that's the first part of Felix Finds Out. And notice Willie has all this schoolwork to do, and Felix is not letting. We all have Felixes in our life. The word Felix is actually Latin for happy. So we all have these happy distractions that keep us from doing all our schoolwork. And what's going to happen here, I don't know. We'll have to come back and see what happens. Those hot dogs are chasing the cat. Okay, so back to Plato. I was going to teach you a new word, a new Greek word, ancient Greek word, aporia. And this is ancient Greek for a state, a situation where one does not know how to go forward. Things look impassable. And the word is actually broken up in two parts. The A is the privative without, and then the second part comes from the word poros, which means passage. Right? We know the word porous. When something's porous, things can pass through, right? Water can get through a material that's porous. So aporia means that things can't get through. It doesn't seem like there's any way through, no passage. Now, why am I teaching you this word, this ancient Greek word at this moment? Well, right before this, I asked you, well, how's this method working out, right? The dialectical method that Plato is putting forth in order to discover reality, to be able to distinguish between a definition that turns out to only appear to be a definition in distinction to the real definition of something. And in Plato's dialogues, and this happens pretty much in all of them, right? The interlocutors and Socrates are trying to define something, and they always come to a point where it appears that they no longer see a way to form a new definition. Right? And it's usually not Socrates. Remember, Socrates always asks the authority in the conversation to give the definitions and to make changes to the definitions. They come to a point where they're not sure. Every definition they've given so far doesn't pass. They have to repeat and go back to step one. And now they've done this enough times, they're not sure what would be a good definition, right? And many times the interlocutor speaking to Socrates is unwilling to admit that all their proposed definitions have failed, right? Because they're an authority on the subject. And so for them to admit that they failed is in many ways to undermine that authority that they entered with when the conversation started. So it appears that all the previous definitions have problems and they can't come up with a new definition, so there appears to be no way forward. And that's how most of the dialogues end. They end in a state of aporia. But if you're a close reader, in most of the dialogues, there's lots of hints and there's lots of avenues forward that are not picked up. And often they're not picked up because whoever the interlocutor is, they're blind to that particular path forward. They don't see it. And so it becomes left up to the reader, who's a close reader, to say, well, what about this other definition? Would that work? And so it's a real invitation. All these dialogues are invitations at the end for you, the reader, to pick up where the interlocutor left off and go further. And it's always, in reading these dialogues, it's this incredible journey where you're always trying to go further. So I encourage everybody to check out the dialogues of Plato. So they're written, thousands of years ago. They're out of copyright, and many of the translations are also out of copyright because they were translated in 1924 or prior. So there's many available copies in translation circulating on the internet. So look for them. Okay. So let's make some observations from that experience we had before with the square experiment. Right? At first, I drew something, and we said it was a square. And then on second thought, we said it looks like a square. It resembles a square. And I said, well, then where's the actual square? And we thought about that. And we said, well, the actual square is in our mind. Right? It's an idea of the square. The square, that's the idea, is a perfect square. And it's different than the imperfect square that was drawn by me. So what am I doing right now? Right? These observations, I'm highlighting some words that we can use to describe the differences between that which we saw with our eyes and that which we grasp with our mind. And I want you, while you're watching this video, to have a notebook out. It's always important to take notes when you're trying to learn something, or else if it's in one ear, out the other. You want it to stay inside your mind. You got to reinforce it. And while you're watching this, I want you to build up a table where you talk about the thing we see versus the thing we think. Right? This idea versus this example, or this imperfect copy of that idea. So wherever we draw, whatever we're drawing on, it's a copy then of that square, and it's never going to live up to the high standards of what we consider to be a square. So in a sense, every copy we make is going to be a bad copy. Right? When we talk about imperfect, we can say bad, and Plato does this. And so he's connecting imperfect with this word, this moral word, bad. Right? And that means that the idea then, in contrast, would be good. It's the good square, right? Because it follows all the rules, while the square that I drew is the bad square because it doesn't follow the rules. Right? So it's bad. When you don't follow rules, you're bad. You're breaking laws. You're a lawbreaker. So there's also this moral element in this theory that we're developing of Plato, and it's built right into his metaphysics of what's real. So what is real is good. What's not real, what's kind of fake, is going to be bad. Okay, so let's keep moving. And actually, what did I do here? It looks like it's time to go back to the show. And, well, we've got to figure out what's going on with these hot dogs. And we also have to see what's going to happen to Willie, who did not do his work, right? Because he went off and is hanging out with Felix the cat. All right, so let's see the next segment of Felix Finds Out. Okay, so I've just actually combined parts 2 and 3 of the show, Felix Finds Out. And I love the part where Willie tries to sneak into class and gets caught by the teacher. I'm sure we can both appreciate that from both sides of the room. And it turns out that Willie has some homework, right? What makes the moon shine? And this is a pretty wild video. It was often called surreal, and it's going to get even more surreal as we go on, as we watch the last part. And so I think it's a great contrast to Plato, right? So Plato's all about reality, and we're watching this animation that's going to increasingly become more and more surreal. Also, the homework is about the moon, right? The moon. And this is funny because Plato is a philosopher of the sun. And we're going to learn about next video what that really means. But he's definitely, clearly a philosopher of the sun. We can begin to sort of sketch that out because he's a rationalist. And when the sun's out, we can actually see things. We can see what things are. Right? So it's closer to reality. But at nighttime, when the moon comes out, when it's dark outside, you can't see as well. And things often, start to look strange. Weird things happen, shadows all of a sudden look like monsters. Sounds we all of a sudden notice in the dark, and they sound also like monsters. A lot of monsters at night. And with the moon out, there's lots of werewolves out in the countryside and in the streets of the city hunting. But ironically, on the actual moon itself, there is a crater that is named after Plato, and it's an impact crater, which is different than a volcanic crater. It was formed by something striking, and it must have struck the moon at almost a 90-degree angle, because it looks very close to a perfect circle. And Plato's very interested in shapes and perfect shapes, right? Like that perfect square. Here's that perfect circle. So they named this crater after Plato. It's not the largest crater on the moon, but it's really a great circular one. And it's actually, for me, it's pretty huge. It's 101 kilometers in diameter, 63 miles. It's almost a mile deep. And it's 3.84 billion years approximately old. And so we've got some pictures from NASA here, and you can see that it's actually, when you pull out, it's not the largest crater on the moon. Okay, so another thing that's pretty interesting is the word for moon in Latin was luna, and moon, and we get words like lunacy, madness, from that word for the moon. And madness, lunacy, is to be overcome with irrationality, and that's the opposite of rationalism. So rationalism is going to be more about the sun. Have this connection. We'll work that out more in the next video. All right. So looking forward, let's continue making some observations about our experience of rationalism, that's our experience of Platonism, the square experiment. Let's talk about perception itself. What's going on in perception? What is Plato's theory of perception? And so if we look back at what's happening, we see something, and it only makes sense to us because it resembles something that's inside our mind. So there's this experience of referring back to something that's inside our mind. and that what we see in relation to something that's already within us. So everything we perceive is in relation to those ideas in our mind. We look out at the world, yet to look out, we must already be looking back and within our mind, where the form or ideas already reside. And I use the word form and idea interchangeably, and you find in many different translations of Plato that both these words are used to translate the same word. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, so the ideas within our mind come first. Right? They're primary, they're original. You can't have a copy if there isn't already something that you're copying from. Right? So the square that I drew on the paper, I wouldn't have been able to draw unless I didn't already have an idea of what a square is in my mind to draw that out. So that idea has to be first for Plato and in Platonism. It's the original. So when we go around perceiving things, right, we're being referred back to something that's already in our mind. Okay. So the idea or form of the square is something that we cannot erase or destroy. Right? Have you ever tried to destroy an idea? It's impossible. Right? Ideas are not physical objects, and we can't just make them go away. We could get people to not talk about them, but the idea still exists. It's something that's indestructible. But that square that I drew on the paper, right, that I put on the paper, this square, I can begin to do a lot of different things to it. I can start to cover it over. If it was pencil, I could start to erase it. But I can also go like this. I can start just tearing up. This square does no longer exist. I have destroyed it. I'm going to burn this later. I hopefully won't hurt myself. Okay, so the copy is something that can be erased. It can go out of existence. It can cease to be. Right? This is going to be another one of these important differences. So the idea of a square, it neither comes into being nor out of being, because you can't destroy it. And we don't create these ideas. It's just they've been there forever, right? They've always been there. So it's the idea neither comes into being nor out of being. It's just there in our mind. Whereas all these other things that we can draw and make, I have to actually go out and draw it. So at some point it comes into being, and then at some other point eventually it will come out of being. Okay. Let's think about chairs for a second. And philosophers do a lot of thinking about chairs. Why? Because they spend a lot of time writing and reading, and they're usually in chairs when they do that. And so they start to talk about chairs. You can go through the history of philosophy, and you will find examples of this. Descartes writing about sitting in his chair. Okay, so the idea of a chair. Right? The idea of a chair is our definition of a chair. And that definition is an articulation of the essence of a chair. We're going to say these are the core things that a chair is. And we could bundle that all together and say that's chairness. Right? Now, chairness is not a real word in English, but when we add the NESS to any word, we aren't talking about different things. We're talking about what makes it what it is. So when we come up with a definition of a chair, we're basically saying what chairness is. Now, this idea is a definition or this form of a chair, or the square that we talked about at the beginning, is something that's universal. Right? So that definition will apply to every single instance. So any chair that we talk about, if it's a chair, it's going to fit our definition of a chair. just like any square that we talk about is going to be modeled after that definition of a square that we listed at the beginning. So the definition or the idea or the form is universal. It applies to a whole bunch of things, all of the things that fit within that category, within that class, within that type, within that kind of thing, that ness, is going to apply. So if we're defining a chair, that definition will apply to all chairs anywhere in the world. So we have to come up with a universal definition. Something maybe about how a chair provides support to the body, other than standing. And it has to be a definition that's going to be inclusive enough, right? Because there's so many different types of chairs out there that this definition has to include all of them that we want to say, yeah, that's a chair. But we also want to make sure it's not so universal that it includes things that we don't want it to. Right? That's part of that process, that dialectical process, where we sharpen our definitions, get them exact. So the specific words we use to reference this idea, the chairness, are different depending on what language we are speaking. Right? So the language itself is going to be different depending on what language you speak, or which language, if you speak more than one, which language you're choosing. But the idea itself is always the same, no matter the language. So it's the idea, not the word. Right? We're making a distinction here between words and ideas. And the idea itself is always the same, whether we say seat or asiento or una silla, does not matter. It's the idea that is the same. Okay. So what we're doing as we talk about this, we're distinguishing between the idea and the copy, the thing, the example, is we're developing the theory of forms or ideas that is foundational to Platonism. Right? And Plato doesn't actually say, here's my theory of forms, or here's my theory of ideas. It's left to the reader to kind of put this all together. And as you read the dialogues, it starts to coalesce into a theory. And this theory solves a problem. It's called the problem of the one over the many. Right? And this problem is that there's such a wide variety of different things in the world, different kinds of chairs, from stools to bean bags to lazy chairs to all these different types, office chairs, sling chairs, kneeling chairs, all these different types of chairs. How is it that all these different chairs can be referred to as a chair, as one thing? Right? How do we have the many being called one thing? And Plato's answer is, well, they all share or participate in the idea of chairness. So that's what connects them, is the idea that they're all connected to. So it's an answer to this problem of diversity, what connects. And we talked about this when we talked about the pre-Socratic philosophers and the search for the arche, that which brings everything together. Right? And we went back to Thales, who said water. Water is what brings the many, all these different things we see in life, together into one. And here we have the theory of forms, showing how many can come together as one. Okay, so move on to the next slide. Continue talking now about this theory of forms. Plato is going to conclude that these forms, right, these perfect ideas of things, have no beginning, they're uncreated, and they have no end, they're imperishable. Which means we can say that our ideas, our forms, our definitions are eternal. Right? If something has no beginning and no end, then it lasts forever. And something that's eternal, we would say, is infinite. It's without end. So, sort of further understanding this important theory of forms and the important distinctions that Plato has given us in Platonism. And the copies, the images, those come to be, they're created, and they cease to be, they're perishable. So we can say that they are temporary or finite. Right? Something that's finite has a clear beginning and end. And it's temporary because it doesn't persist through all of time. It's here for a piece of time. All right, so we're going to watch the end of the show, and it's going to get more surreal. And interesting thing to think about as you watch this last part is that this is produced in 1924, and this is when the United States is under prohibition, right? So it's illegal to drink alcohol. All right, what a great show. I think I'm probably going to have nightmares from the psychedelic flying elephant. All right, so if you can't figure out how the moon shines, then maybe your second best option is moonshine. What is moonshine? What is alcohol? It's a way for many of us to try to escape, right? We feel like we need an escape. Plato is also about trying to escape. Right? He's trying to escape from the world of appearance, where things just appear to us to be real, to reality itself. How do we escape from the world of appearance to get to the world of reality? So, as we study Plato, we can think about that. We can think of Plato as an escape artist. He's teaching us how to free ourselves, right? When we escape, we're trying to be free from something. Okay, so we're almost done. We're now in the final part of part 2. And, well, first we have to say that Plato is going to connect up reality with persistence, right? Because the things that are real, they don't ever disappear on us. They're always there. They're reliable. Something that's there one day, gone the next, lacks reality. It's not fully real. It's just temporarily there, and then it's gone. It's a mixture of being real and not real. But for something to be completely real, to be a part of reality, it must persist. And so we have these two things being closely connected, persisting through time. Right. So, bring this back a little bit to William James in a moment. So, in Platonism, the form of the idea is the original. And when we try to make something, we make a copy, and that copy is imperfect. But we can keep trying to make copies that are better and better. Right? And this gives us a conception of progress. That progress is about perfecting things, trying to get them better and better, closer and closer to the idea or the ideal. And that's how we progress. And we can contrast that with William James, who was giving us an idea of progress as novelty, as coming up with something new, something different. And that was progress. So we have two different ways of thinking about progress. You can sort of compare those. All right. So I told you I was going to talk more about the Greek word that we're translating when we talk about form, idea, or, as William James said, concept. And that word is eidos. And in forms, it shows up as ideia, which makes you think idea. But the word actually comes from manufacturing. So like we talked about the word bias, and it turned out that word came from architecture. It had to do with something being slanted and trying to build on level ground without any bias. With the word eidos, it's going to come from manufacturing, and the word eidos means a form or a mold, in the sense of a mold. And molds are used in manufacturing to shape things. So back in ancient Greece and Athens, you had bakeries. And in the bakery, they baked the bread inside molds. And they had, for instance, a mold of the goddess Aphrodite. And so you could go out and you could buy Aphrodite bread. I've never seen that for sale, but when I was growing up, I ate a lot of animal crackers and those little cookies. They're not really crackers, but those cookies were all shaped in the mold of different animals, and something like that. So the word eidos is really closer to the word form in the sense of a mold that was used to create something in the shape of that mold. So this is really what's happening, right, in the theory of forms, that ideas are like molds, and we try to build things in the shape of that mold. And so the things that we see, these copies, are just like that Aphrodite bread or animal crackers. And when we build a chair, we're building something in the mold of the idea of the chair. When I drew that square, I was trying to make something in the mold of that perfect square. And that's what guided my movement and led me to shape it in the way that I did. Okay, so I told you that you should be taking notes and really trying to organize a table where you're sort of building up the language between these two categories of the idea, the form, and then what we'll call for now the individual things. And so here's one example. There's more you could put in this list, but here's some of the things that I talked about that I use to distinguish on these different sides. And in the end, on one side we have the real, the actual. On the other side we have the not real, the not actual. Okay, in the next video, we're going to get deeper into our understanding of Platonism, and we're going to talk more about the sun, and we're going to talk about something called the divided line. And we can see that we're already sort of doing that, because when we built this table, we're sort of putting a line between two separate things. Okay, so I look forward to the next video.